The storm arrived before sunset. By nightfall, rain swept through the narrow streets while wind hammered the cathedral doors. Families hurried inside for shelter. Then came a sound, low, deep, a groan somewhere within the stone. Heads tilted upward, parents pulled children closer. Everyone stared toward the vaulted ceiling, except an old mason named Elias. He was looking at the floor. Another gust struck the cathedral. The sound came again. Elias knew what lay beneath his feet. No one else did. They saw magnificent columns, towering arches, and stained glass windows. Elias remembered something else, a rough block of stone, a hammer, a chisel, and a lesson he had once been too young to understand. Nearly 50 years earlier, long before anyone admired the cathedral, Elias had spent days perfecting a stone no visitor would ever see. And once he finished it, the stone was meant to disappear. Elias was 20 when construction began. There was no cathedral then, only a vast excavation surrounded by timber scaffolding, stone carts, ropes, and craftsmen covered in pale dust. Elias loved watching them work. Carvers shaped delicate patterns. Masons prepared enormous columns. Others formed the pointed arches that would someday stand above the cathedral doors. Those were the assignments Elias wanted. He imagined visitors stopping beneath something he had made and asking who had created it. He wanted his work to be remembered. Then one morning, Matthias, the master mason, called him across the yard. Elias hurried over. Matthias pointed toward a massive, rough block sitting apart from the decorative stonework.
That one. What will it become? A foundation stone.
Elias looked toward the excavation.
How much of it will remain visible? None.
Around him, craftsman was shaping stones destined for sunlight. Elias had been given one destined for darkness. Matthias handed him a chisel.
Begin.
At first, Elias worked carefully. Hammer, chisel, measure, again. Days passed, and the rough block slowly became square. But Elias kept noticing the craftsmen around him. Visitors admired their carvings. They pointed toward the arches. Sometimes they even praised the men responsible. Nobody stopped beside Elias. One afternoon, he ran a straight edge across his stone and found a slight unevenness near one corner. Correcting it properly would take hours. Elias stared at the flaw. Soon the stone would be underground. No one would ever see this surface again. He set down the straight edge. Good enough. The next morning, Matthias inspected the stone. His fingers stopped directly over the imperfection.
Finish it.
Elias frowned.
It won't be visible. I know. It'll be underground. I know.
Matthias handed him the straight edge.
Finish it.
Elias corrected the surface. Then Matthias found an edge that wasn't perfectly square. Elias corrected that too. Then came another measurement, another correction. Finally, Elias dropped his chisel.
Why?
Matthias stopped.
No one will see this stone. Once they build over it, nobody will even know which one was mine.
Matthias placed a hand against the block. Then he pointed toward the cathedral entrance taking shape across the yard.
If this stone stood beside those doors, would you leave that edge unfinished?
No.
Then why should being unseen change the quality of your work?
Elias had no answer. He understood the question. He just wasn't sure he believed it. Matthias placed the chisel back into his hand.
Finish it.
Years would pass before Elias understood why. For 3 more days, Elias worked. But something changed. He stopped watching the craftsmen at the entrance. He stopped noticing the visitors. He concentrated on the stone in front of him. Every surface, every edge, every measurement. When Matthias finally returned, he inspected the block in silence. Then he gave a small nod. This time, it was enough. The following morning, workers wrapped ropes around the stone and slowly lowered it into the foundation. Mortar surrounded it. Another stone was placed beside it, then another above it. The dark vein across one corner disappeared last. Within weeks, Elias couldn't see his stone at all. The cathedral continued upward, and some of his finest work disappeared beneath it. Years passed. The cathedral rose above the town. Walls became arches. Columns climbed toward vaulted ceilings, and Elias rose with them. His hands grew steadier, his judgment sharper. Eventually, he received the assignments he had once dreamed about. He shaped visible stone around the cathedral entrance. He worked on columns that generations would see. And finally, visitors stopped to admire his craftsmanship. Elias enjoyed the recognition, but it didn't feel quite as satisfying as he had imagined. Sometimes he stood inside the unfinished cathedral, looking upward at everything they had built. Then his eyes drifted toward the ground. Somewhere beneath his feet was the first piece of the cathedral that had truly tested him. And whenever he remembered it, he heard Matthias's question.
Should being unseen change the quality of your work?
Elias was beginning to understand. Years later, the cathedral was finished. The scaffolding came down, the construction yard emptied, and the great building finally stood unobstructed above the town. People filled the square to admire it. Elias found Matthias standing away from the crowd. The old master's shoulders had stooped, but his eyes still studied the stonework as carefully as ever. Elias stood beside him. After all these years, which part makes you proudest? He expected Matthias to look toward the towers. Instead, the old mason looked down, the parts that never gave us reason to worry. Elias followed his gaze toward the cathedral floor. For a moment, he could almost see that rough foundation block again. This time, he didn't ask what Matthias meant. Not long afterward, the old master died. But whenever Elias corrected a joint nobody would notice, or checked a measurement nobody would question, he still heard the same words, "Finish it." Then decades passed, and the cathedral faced its greatest test. The storm arrived before sunset. By nightfall, water filled the streets. Wind tore tiles from roofs as families fled toward the cathedral for shelter. Elias was an old man now. His hair had turned gray-white, and his back had bent, but he still noticed stonework the way Matthias had taught him. Then came the sound, low, deep, a groan moving through the cathedral. Everyone looked upward. Elias listened. He studied the columns, the arches, then the floor. Suddenly, he remembered exactly where he had stood nearly 50 years earlier. Beneath layers of masonry was his stone. He remembered every imperfection Matthias had made him correct. Every measurement he once believed didn't matter. Another gust struck the building, and Elias finally understood the full weight of his master's question. The cathedral was being tested from its highest tower, all the way down to the work nobody could see. By morning, the storm had weakened. People stepped outside. The town had suffered. Roof tiles covered the streets. Several smaller buildings were damaged, but the cathedral remained. Masons inspected the structure. Its arches had endured. Its columns had carried their loads, and beneath everything visible were foundations built decades earlier. Elias stood quietly inside as morning light passed through the stained glass. People would continue admiring the windows, the arches, the entrance he had helped shape, but Elias looked down. Somewhere beneath his feet was a plain stone with a dark vein across one corner. Nobody had applauded when he finished it. For nearly 50 years, nobody had thought about it. Yet all that time, the stone had quietly done its work. It had never needed to be seen to matter. Years later, Elias found a young apprentice preparing a structural stone near the cathedral. The boy ran a straight edge across its surface. A slight imperfection remained. He looked toward Elias.
"Do I really need to fix that?"
Elias said nothing.
"It'll be covered. No one will ever see it."
For a moment, Elias was 20 again. Stone dust on his sleeves, a foundation block before him, an old master at his side. Elias walked over and ran his weathered fingers across the floor. He could have explained everything. Instead, he placed the straight edge into the apprentice's hands.
"Finish it.
The boy frowned. Elias smiled.
Finish it."
The apprentice reached for his chisel, and the lesson began again. Years passed. Elias eventually disappeared from the cathedral workshop, but the cathedral remained. Generations walked through its doors. Visitors admired the stained glass, the columns, and the towering arches, but nobody asked about the stone buried beneath the floor. They didn't know where it was. They didn't know who shaped it. They would never see the surfaces Elias spent days making true. And none of that changed its value, because some of the most important work we do happens where nobody is watching, in details nobody checks, in promises quietly kept, in responsibilities that earn no applause. Those things are easy to dismiss because they are invisible, but invisible does not mean unimportant. Sometimes, what nobody sees is what everything else is standing on. So when nobody applauds, when nobody notices, when nobody will ever know how much care you gave something, finish it anyway. Because true excellence isn't the standard you keep when people are watching. It's the standard you keep when no one ever will. Every story leaves a lesson. Every lesson leaves a choice. If today's story stayed with you, subscribe to Motivating Morals. Until our next story, keep choosing wisdom.